Hello and welcome. This is Pay Attention, interviews about truth in troubling times. And today I am so really thrilled and grateful to be here with Ken Wilber. Ken Wilber is an American philosopher, probably one of the best known American philosophers. He's a writer on transpersonal psychology and his own integral theory, a systematic philosophy which describes a synthesis of all human knowledge and experience. His books include A Brief History of Everything, The Spectrum of Consciousness, Grace and Grit, which is a memoir written with his late wife that is now a movie also, Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, and The Transformation of Consciousness, and many more, actually. So welcome, Ken. It's just totally wonderful to be able to talk with you in these difficult times.
Well, thank you. It's very nice to be here with you.
So what I'm going to do is to try to get a framework for us to understand your overall point of view before we talk about just this particular time we're in. So I want to start by talking about these four frames of reference that you use in your integral theory as ways of looking at not only humans as individuals, but also, human groups and politics and endeavors. I find them very useful ways of thinking. And they're called waking up, growing up, cleaning up, and showing up. And I wonder if you could just give us a sense, sketch those out for us.
Sure. These are four different ways that human beings can move, and in a sense, four different ways that human beings can continue to grow up and continue to flesh out all the potentials that they have. So we have waking up, growing up, cleaning up, and showing up. I sometimes include opening up now, which I'll mention briefly at the end. Waking up is something that worldwide is quite well known, but in Western psychology is almost always excluded. And waking up just refers to what's often called enlightenment or awakening. And the thing to realize about a genuine awakening experience or an enlightenment experience is that it's a first-person, direct, immediate experience. When you have it, you know you're having it. And generally, it results in profound shifts in awareness, and particularly a shift in identity. So the most common one is you go from just thinking you're this self-skin encapsulated ego structure, you're your own self, you recognize who you are, and everything out there is not self and other and different. And with a strong awakening experience, you wake up to a sense that you're actually one with everything. You're arising in the complete unity consciousness with everything that you're aware of. And it eventually includes the entire universe. You become one with what is technically called in mystical circles things like a ground of all being or an ultimate unity consciousness. In Zen, it's called a satori, and so on. And these are profound experiences, and they are the essential goal. If you look at the world's religious structures, the way, let's say, a perennial philosopher will, which is what do all of the world's great religions have in common? And if you look at the core of all the great world religions, what you will find is an experience of waking up, an experience of finding this absolute unity with the ground of all being, this oneness with the divine reality. And that's a very profound experience. In Buddhism, of course, it's taken to be the ultimate goal of the entire religious path. And it's profound because if you look at it and listen to people describe it, they really do. It's 99% of the people that have a real satori, a real waking up experience, describe it as being in touch with an ultimate reality. That's the most meaningful and profound experience they've had in their entire life. The last sort of well-known Western psychologist that took these waking up experiences seriously was William James. And if you read his Variety of Religious Experience, that's what he's talking about, the varieties of this absolute oneness that people feel. And James's pragmatic view, of course, with those were as real can get, because that's the effect they have on people. And that's the way people describe them. So waking up is a profoundly important human potential. And it's certainly something that people would want to take seriously. So what Western psychologists often pay attention to is the second framework, which is a growing up experience. And what growing up means is, if we watch human beings, if you watch like a 6-month-old child, can the child speak, do mathematics, become a piano player, become a brain surgeon? No, none of those. If you track it as human beings grow and develop, what you find is that they actually go through a series of stages of development, or even levels of development. And the researchers that have looked at this find that once they outline a set of stages of developmental awareness, that if they're correct, then these stages tend to be similar in all people that grow up and grow through them. They are given different names. And I should say that one of the things that Western psychologists generally acknowledge is that there are multiple intelligences or different lines of development that go through these different levels of development. And there are a lot of models of development or models of growing up, because often a researcher will focus on a particular line or a particular multiple intelligence and study that in particular. So Piaget tended to focus on cognitive intelligence. Kohlberg tended to focus on moral intelligence. Jane Levenger tracked self-concept intelligence. Maslow tracked need intelligence. So
let me stop you just for, I'll put you on a pause here for a
Sure.
moment, just to sketch out a couple of things, and we'll go forward then. Because I studied with Jane Levenger, she directed my dissertation, and of course I knew Kohlberg. And what I think is so important when people think of stage, I want to go back to waking up too, but let's stay with growing up. When people think of stages of development, unless they've studied these structural models that you are now elucidating, there is the feeling that somehow this is chronological. That this is a result of years passing. Yes, in the beginning of life, there is that kind of change in stages of development as the organism changes. It affords this unfolding. But there's a point after which, and you make this very clear in all your work, there's a point after which, as we enter adulthood, where some people plateau and just kind of remain at that entry point, and other people go on. But it's not dependent on chronology.
Yeah, and those stages, particularly after, let's say, the substages of sensory motor intelligence, which do tend to unfold at essentially similar times to a lot of people. And one of the reasons is that they're the oldest stages of development we have. And so in a sense, they've had plenty of time to get settled in. But as you get almost beyond any of those into the early egocentric and certainly the ethnocentric stages, people can indeed, as you're mentioning, grow through those. They'll go through the same sequence of stages, but they can do so at quite different times. And as you say, often people will simply plateau out at
Right.
a middle or even fairly early stage.
Yes,
So,
and that means that there's a whole bunch of the adult population that may
right.
be at a conventional or conformity stage.
And that'll
And
have a lot to do with my interpretation of when we discuss what's going on today.
yes, good.
Interrupt you.
And
Sorry.
so just again, to take one more step back on the waking up side,
Right.
So waking up, as you said, is really being in experiential contact with a fundamental unity, which is actually kind of unspeakable, but people do try to describe it.
Right.
And that profoundly changes your point of view, or you could say it changes your, let's say, heart. It changes something that is very central. However, it interacts with your stage. And
Yes.
what the final product there might be can vary a lot.
Yes.
And so Shinzen Young, who's a friend of mine and has been my teacher and in many ways over many kinds of experiences,
Right.
once talked to me about Osama bin Laden having all the features of waking up.
Right.
He said bin Laden, the way he moves, the way he talks,
Right.
sounds like he has had an awakening.
Right.
But the stage of development
Yeah.
that bin Laden was at was not going to lead him to be a Buddha.
Right.
So that's a good illustration of there can be a real gap between the stage and the waking up.
That's right. And by the way, there's an approach to this. It's called the Wilber-Combs lattice. And what it does is it shows the major states of consciousness across the top, and then the major stages of development up the left-hand side. And the point is you can have whatever state experience you have. And in the waking up process, by the way, if we look at it in fine detail, most of the great stages of waking up actually have sub-stages.
Yes.
So some people, Daniel P. Brown, for example, has looked at an enormous number of meditative state systems, and he finds that on average, they all go through 5 major stages up to a full enlightenment or full waking up. And you sometimes see these stages experienced essentially by themselves. And then we see it go from nature mysticism to deity mysticism to a large formless mysticism to a non-dual or unity mysticism. And whenever a person has one of those experiences, if they have like a nature mystical experience, for example, they'll interpret it according to the stage they're at.
Yes.
And so that becomes really important. And as I was sort of hinting when I talked about there are many models of development, all essentially correct, but many of them dealing with a different aspect of development. Right. For example, if you look at Gene Gebser, who's a very famous developmentalist, he calls the stages archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, and integrated or integral. And the point is, you're talking about how they can be very independent, and indeed they can. The point on the Wilber-Combs lattice is you can have almost any state experience at any stage, major stage of development that you're at.
Yes.
And so if you're having a nature experience and you feel one with all of nature, everything that's manifest, and you're at a mythic stage, you'll likely interpret it in mythic terms.
Yes.
And it might be a biblical myth that you'll interpret. Oh, I'm experiencing my oneness with Jesus or something like that.
Yeah.
Or you can interpret it a rational stage, and then it'll be like Bertrand Russell's interpretation of when he had one of those experiences. It's very rational, and this is what there's no God or anything like that.
Right.
And you can be at a pluralistic stage, a postmodern, multiplistic stage, and then you'll interpret it that way. Or you can be at an integral stage.
Right.
And then you'll tend to interpret it according to the very high developmental terms.
So when people have a waking up, I mean, part of what I think is confusing for lots of people is that there tends to be a kind of assumption that the experience of unity is going to have some kind of unified expression.
Yeah.
But it really doesn't have that
No.
expression, because you have people who are at different stages of development, adults or sometimes even children.
Right.
And so I often think about a stage as like the window or the lens
Right.
that we have organized by where we are on this kind of path of development, if you want to call it that. It's weird to have any name in it, but it's that window then is what we see through to this experience of unity.
Right.
And then we describe it from our window,
Right.
which
And those are relatively independent.
yes,
You can
exactly.
be fairly high in state development and fairly low in stage development, or most Americans, even ones that are at pluralistic or integral stages, have never had a real satori or a real
That's right.
waking up experience. So
That's
you
right.
can be high or low on any of those scales. And by the way, that's essentially true for all four frames I'm about to mention. They are all relatively independent.
Okay.
And this is why many people have not heard of all four of these frames, because and then they all have their own individual characteristics. So waking up is always a first person experience, but growing up is always a third person. In other words, a person is at a particular stage of development. These stages of development interiorly are much like grammar. We can't look within and see grammar right now. I can't give you all the rules that I'm following. You and I are both following when we speak English grammar, but it's in there. It's just their third person, it's, or objects, can't really be well perceived. And that's really important, because a person who has like a strong oneness with, let's say, deity mysticism, and feels that they actually are in touch with a divine being, they will interpret that according to the stage of development they're at. So they can be at an archaic or a magic or a mythic or rational or pluralistic or an integral stage. They will know they're having this divine experience. That will hit them right in the face.
Right.
But they'll have if they're at magic or at rational or at integral, they'll have no idea that they're thinking according to the terms of that stage, and that they're actually interpreting their experience in a particular fashion. So most fundamentalists, believers in any form of religion, tend to come from the mythic stage of development.
Right.
Fowler even called it a mythic literal stage of development.
Right. I think that's actually, I like Fowler's work on religions, and I do think that the mythopoetic, which Jung valued so much, and many of my Jungian colleagues value, people that are using that fail to see the literalness of it, that the literalness actually is part of the problem that leads people to go to war with each other over their gods. You know? So it's that is I think a very essential thing to point out.
And that tends to be true for a great portion of the world's mythology. When myth first appeared to people, it generally was at the truly mythic, literal stage of development in humanity's unfolding. And again, they would have no idea that they were actually giving an interpretation to something. So when somebody first wrote down Moses parted the Red Sea, that's actually a mythic conception that somebody could actually part a real physical river. And when they wrote Moses parted the Red Sea, they might have meant, and generally people that take a mythic view and move to higher stages of development, like somebody who's rational and has a mythic experience, they'll generally interpret it by giving it a very deep symbolic meaning to the myth. So if somebody who's at a rational or pluralistic stage of development, and they read the Bible and they read something like Moses parted the Red Sea, and somebody asks them about it, they'll say, well, what they meant was, at this time in history, the people of Israel were going through very difficult periods of a lot of constraints and restraints and obstacles and so on. And Moses was this powerful leader that helped them move through any of those obstacles. And so they gave it a mythic meaning by saying he parted the Red Sea. And that's what they really meant. And
Right.
go, no, actually, what they really meant was he stood next to the Red Sea and moved his hands and it parted. That almost all myths have that kind of mythic, literal meaning. And that's
so
certainly what
so do people who have
stage of development have found.
Well, people who have psychotic experiences, again, a lot of people looking at someone who's having a psychotic experience actually hears it as a metaphor.
Right.
But the person having that experience is having that experience literally.
Right.
He doesn't feel like a brick falls on his head. A brick falls on his head.
Right.
And so, it's really complicated when we get into trying to talk about particularly spiritual experiences. But also even, I was thinking when you were talking the parting the Red Sea, you can talk about splitting the atom in the same literal way. If you literally believe that literally this is what is literally going on, it becomes mythic. And then you go into that mythic way of speaking, which is actually, it's a just so kind of story. But it's again one of the confusing things about trying to understand somebody else's experiences. So yes, please continue, because I'm loving this, and we haven't gotten to the cleaning up and showing up. But I've found these waking up and growing up I've used over time to try to look at particularly aspects of Zen Buddhism, because many of the really important masters in Zen Buddhism went into the monastery when they were 14 to 16, and they had to remain there until they had a complete waking up. So they come out at 36 and they haven't grown up. And then they create teachings related to their waking up, but those teachings have an immaturity about them that never gets,
it's a real problem.
It's a problem.
And that's one of the reasons that the developmental researchers, of which are primary ones, of course, Jane Lovinger, but we've got a lot of modern geniuses who actually started following real human beings as they went through these various stages of growing up. And this wasn't really the first real genius American psychologist who did this. Was a guy named James Mark Baldwin.
Oh, yes.
He did it around the turn of the century, around 1900. He was, of course, a friend with William James. And so while William James was studying varieties of waking up and making pioneering varieties of religious experience and so on, his friend James Mark Baldwin was studying forms of growing up. And he studied it in the good, the true, and the beautiful. In other words, he studied it in moral development, and he studied in scientific development, and he studied it in artistic development. And then he added a fourth strand that he just thought was important, but there wasn't generally a name for it, which was religious development. And he followed the stages through that. And again, he found variations on archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, and integral. And so that was only a little over 100 years ago. And in all the world's great religions, none of them displayed an actual understanding of the stages of growing up. It was understood, you could sort of chronologically look at a person and come up with the 7 ages of humankind, young child, in young childhood, and then growing into the middle range, and then into young adulthood, and then older adulthood, and then elderhood. So they would come up with those kinds of things. But those, again, are actual chronological, biological changes. They all happen in an essentially similar time period, and so on. But in terms of understanding the actual ways that a human being's worldview and actual moral structures and egoic structures would actually change, so you could both be 30 years old and have completely different worldviews.
Yes.
I mean, one could be literally at a magic and 30 years old, and the other one could be at a pluralistic or an integral stage.
Right.
And they wouldn't be able to hardly understand what each other's saying.
Totally.
And this is a profoundly important discovery, is the growing up, because no school of present day waking up has any understanding of like Levenger's stage of development or what that means. And so you're talking about a person that originally would go through the monastery and come out at age 30 and went in at age 14 and essentially got frozen at whatever stage of growing up they had.
Right.
Every world religion faced that problem, because no world religion understood the stages of growing up that you go through, even if you're on a path of waking up, because they are relatively independent.
Yeah, and just 1 second, just to put a fine point on it, you know, when I was working with Jane, she had just done the big study of the U.S. Stages of ego development. They sampled a population that was like the U.S. population, and when I understood, and I kind of inherently moved towards her ideas before I really understood how profound they were. They were neo-Piagetian, and I loved Piaget and so on. But what I saw in kind of a flash, it was almost like a waking up, why people go to war over so many differences in opinion, because they don't know that these are just differences in opinion. It seems to them, it seems to the individuals, that these are truths that are being distorted from this other perspective. And it's only really very late in the development of these stages that you're able to see the whole range in that kind of integrated way, understanding where each one has validity. You know, up until then, and really until in Levenger's later stages, you know, integrated is her last stage, and there's so few cases relative to her research that they weren't even normed. You couldn't norm them. But you know, up until those last couple of stages, it is not possible to get along. I mean, on these big issues, and that's, to me, one of the big insights about that kind of stage theory.
And that goes hand in hand with those earlier stages. Actually, most of the stages growing up don't know, because they can't look within and see those different stages. If we could, if they were first person experiences like waking up stages were, then every time we change one, we'd know it. It'd be a real, whoa, I'm no longer that, I'm one with all of that. Wow. I mean, when you have, if you're meditating, you have an experience of all of a sudden being one with the world and love and bliss, you know it.
You know it.
No doubt about it. When you go from Jane Levenger's 3rd to 4th to 5th stage, you have no idea that that's happening. And it just becomes part of your subject, and your subject looks at objects and it thinks in a certain way. And like you say, that leads to all kinds of disasters, including most of the wars we get into. And that's just really horrible.
You know, it's a kind of, you know, when you see this, when you get this map, then you just want to give the map to everybody, but nobody wants it. And particularly a lot of the spiritual types don't want it. I mean, I don't know how many times people have said, I don't think in a linear way. well, this
Yeah.
is not linear. This is not linear. It's holistic. It's you know
Right.
what you. It's basically paradigms that
Right.
integrate other paradigms,
Right.
and it's not it's not linear. But you
Right.
can't explain it unless
Right.
somebody knows it. You can't tell them.
Right.
So it's not, and it's not like waking up, like you say.
No,
It's
it's not, and that's really a problem. Um, I mentioned that most of these frames that I have used, they're all relatively independent
yes,
and relatively independent, but largely. And I think because of that, if you're particularly developed in one of these frameworks and you're sort of highly sensitive and aware of your own internal being, that learning about one of these frameworks won't tell you anything about the others. That's why if that had happened, and if people had a waking up experience, they would immediately start investigating their growing up stages.
yes,
And all the world's religions would have Lovinger stages of development, or Maslow stages,
right,
or Piaget stages, and none of
right,
them do,
right,
because they're
right,
completely unaware of what was happening in the growing up dimension of their own being.
right.
And you can't hardly imagine what a different world it would be if the Bible presented not only its version of waking up, and also its own, whatever stage of growing up it is, in a moral stage, or all of those are included. The fact that waking up and growing up are independent doesn't mean that you can go through one entirely without having any of the others.
Right, right.
So
Yeah, it's just
but
it's a
if you can
yeah,
imagine how different it would be if the Bible included
yeah,
all of its injunctions and recommendations, stages of growing up, and said, if you're at this stage, we recommend you do this. But if you're at this stage, you should do something quite different. You should try doing this. It would have been
yes.
a completely different world.
Well, even as you're saying this, I'm reading Jung's Black books right now. Somebody suggested that I read that. I mean, it's really difficult, but I can't really read the Red book. But the thing about Jung, and he has a profound sense of how personality works, but he doesn't have the growing up thing.
No.
And so he makes so many mistakes of assuming that the sort of mythopoetic is literal in a certain way.
Yeah.
And then Jungians assume that something like aging over the human lifespan will bring various kinds of wisdom and insight,
Right.
because they don't understand this other dimension.
Right.
Yes. So even with, even if there were one little handbook for for
Yeah.
people who work as psychoanalysts even
Right.
on this, but there's not.
No.
And unless you know this map, you
Right.
just don't get it.
Right.
You're absolutely right about that. And it's a shame, because right now there is this kind of knowledge available, but it's not widely available.
Right. And because of that, I've always, I mean, it's sort of ironic, because I got onto my study of developmental psychology largely because of my practice of Zen. And the only reason that happens, when you get into Zen, you do learn that whether they say it explicitly or not, what every master would say if he put it in explicit words is, you're here to change your identity. We're going to take a little narrow self you, and if you get us correctly, you're going to end up identifying with what the Nirvana Sutra calls the Maha-Atman, the great self, the self that's one with everything. And so I had that in my background, and I thought, well, and they do sort of describe stages that goes through, and that sort of put me on the study of stages of development. And it was about 5 to 6 or 7 years before I realized, I slowly would start to say, wait a minute, that's not Zen Satori. That's a definite change in consciousness, but it's much more explicit in certain ways.
Yeah.
Like when you read Gene Gebser talking about magic, he's talking about an actual structure,
Right.
and that
Right.
it has this dimensions, and it looks at time this way, and it reacts with the objective world in this way. And then there's a mythic structure, and it does it differently. And then there's a rational structure and a pluralistic structure and an integral structure. And so I started to tease those apart in my own work. And I think that's an important part of the ultimate integral framework, which includes waking up, growing up, cleaning up, opening up, showing up. These are all the results of my own life study. It was,
Wow.
yeah. And I really
Yeah.
got developmental psychology is such an important part of it that I actually did a book called Integral Psychology, which
Oh, yeah.
it doesn't really cover all of psychology the way I would do it, even when I wrote the book. But I did it specifically because as I began studying developmental psychology, I studied basically every developmental psychologist I could find. And so I had lists of the different names that were given to all the stages that they would
Yes.
come up with. And again, because they were often dealing with a different line of development
Yeah.
or different multiple intelligence, then you could see they were talking about the same
Exactly.
level or stage of
Yes.
development, but
Yeah.
because they were working with a particular aspect of development, their names were always quite different from each other. So
Yeah.
I've been
Yeah.
mentioning Gene Gebser's archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, integral, but no other developmental psychologist uses those terms, except in the description when they describe their stage of development, and it's an early egocentric stage, then they'll often say, oh, there's a lot of word magic prevalent at this stage or something like that. And then they'll use it in that way. But it's otherwise quite different. And so when I wrote Integral Psychology, I actually had upwards of 100 charts of different developmentalists. And the ones that started about 100 years ago all had very specific and usually 6 to 8, maybe 9. Levenger, I think, has 9
she has 9, right?
stages
Yes.
of development, and they would be spelled out quite clearly. But then if I went back to people older than 100 years ago, several of the ones that I included in these overall charts of the overall developmental process, they would just have 3 levels, but they would intuit that those stages were there and they were different. They could see it in other people, they could see it in themselves. So even Buddhism, for example, talks about body, mind, and spirit.
Right.
And those are sort of
even the ox herding pictures.
Right.
I was thinking earlier when you were talking that the ox herding pictures don't translate entirely, but there's a way you can say, like, there's like a pre-conformity, conformity, post-conformity that falls across almost all of these systems.
Exactly.
Yes.
And they have those stages there because even if they're at a full stage 5 waking up experience, they have themselves probably, as the brighter of them, had gone through those 3 major realms of development. They went through a pre-conventional, a conventional, and post-conventional stage of development. And so even as they think about it, they will tend to draw on their own interior experience.
Yes.
And so the person in the 10, who's writing the 10 ox herding pictures, was obviously a very, very bright, evolved person. And so when they were thinking about the lowest stages, they were sort of intuiting, trying to feel their own earliest, lowest stages. And so you're going to see that come out in the overall diagram, even though they're not explicitly studying each of the stages of growing up. When they write the 10 ox herding pictures, what they're doing there mostly is going through the actual stages of waking up that Dan Brown found on average there were 5 major levels of awareness. Those are explicitly contained in the Zen ox herding pictures. But we emphasized previously that waking up and growing up, even though they develop independently, they're not just entirely separate. Somebody who goes through all waking up can be at any stage of growing up.
Right.
And that's sort of important to keep in mind.
Well,
and it's true for any of these frameworks. They're all relatively independent.
Well, it's all human. I mean, so there's one aspect of all of this overlapping. It's all developed by humans, experienced by humans, but the different frames of reference that are in growing up, where and I do want to go to cleaning up and showing up just to include those, but
right.
the thing that happens that I think is so problematic, and it's where we're going to go, I believe, in talking about progressive politics today, is that aspects of the pre-conformity or pre-conventional can sound like aspects of the post-conformity or post-conventional.
Right.
And then there's this huge confusion that is makes it almost, I mean, at times I know I have felt almost unable to say anything because
right.
I can see that whatever I say is going to make things more confusing, right, because the logic or the assumptions or point of view or window or whatever,
right,
that it's just not working. you
right.
know,
right.
Yeah.
I actually became fairly well known for a paper I wrote called The Pre-Trans Fallacy.
Oh, I think I know that one. Yes.
Yeah, it talks
yes.
about exactly that.
Yes.
And I noticed it particularly when people were talking about mystical states. And the pre-trans fallacy is stated that, well, I'll give it to you in a more complex form because you're a developmentalist, but in any developmental sequence, there are stages. If you look at, just pick any stage, say stage X, there are several stages that usually lead up to X, and then there are several stages that go beyond X.
Yes.
And my point, so there's pre-X, X, and trans X.
Right.
And I pointed out that pre and trans are often confused because they're both non-X.
Exactly.
So the way I'd state it for simpler people is that pre-rational and trans-rational states are often confused because they're both non-rational.
That's right. That's right.
It became intensely obvious to me when I was studying different writers on the mystical experience, because English usually has, if it has like rational, then it'll have non-rational, or it has liberal, it'll have illiberal.
Right.
So it very often just recognizes two ends of one pair. And if that's on a developmental sequence, you're in trouble.
That's right.
Because that's going to end up pre-X and trans-X.
Yes.
I was getting driven crazy by people saying, well, if you just quit thinking and just emote and feel, you'll be a Zen, you'll get a Zen Satori. And I go, no, that is so pre-rational.
Right. Yes. You know, I'm with you. 110%. I mean, I got into so many troubling conversations. Well, I went to graduate school to do developmental psychology after I had Zen training. So I was also coming in with a certain frame of reference from the spiritual side. And I don't think I had so much problem coming to the psychological side. It was after I left graduate school and studied to be a Jungian analyst, then I had problems.
Yeah.
Then I was talking to people that who simply they didn't know what I was talking about at all.
Right.
And there's no way that you can explain it because, as Jane made clear to me, I mean, though I have to say the way I met Jane is that I took the sentence completion test for ego development, and I did have an integrated stage of development. And I was in a class of hers, a seminar of hers, and she actually picked me out of the seminar and said, she came to talk to me. She said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm this person that's doing this and that." And she said, "Do you want to come and work for me?" It was only later that I realized she had read my sentence completion, because I was like, why does she want me to come and work for her?
Right.
And so anyway, I said, of course I do. I didn't even know what she was doing. I was just taking this seminar where she said, do you want to come and work for me? She was brilliant. And, she was tough and difficult,
Right.
but I had not met a woman who could think like she did.
Yeah.
So I said, of course I want to work for you. And then, I mean, it was like a Zen training working for
Yeah.
her, but she actually chose me because of my results on the sentence completion test.
Right.
So, it took me a long time to realize that the way I was looking at things was not replicated in other people's ways of
Right.
looking, but
Right.
there was no way to explain it to them. And
Right.
so, I know that when I started reading your stuff and I realized that you were out there in the psycho-spiritual world, I really wasn't. I was so happy you were out there. I was hoping you would change everybody's mind.
Right. And one of the defining, in the cognitive line, one of the defining aspects of this integral stage, her highest stage that she called integrated,
Right.
and is that it does tend to do just that in almost any domain it touches. It'll attempt to integrate them, bring things together, to see already existing unities that connect what appears to most everybody else to be separate and different and wandering around. And those kinds of developmental studies have always, well, this is kind of a side note to the point I'm going to bring up. This is always important to me for philosophical reasons as well. Like everybody's heard of it, when a tree falls in the forest and nobody's around to hear it, doesn't fall.
Right.
Well, if we're in a world of interconnections and nobody's at integral to see it, are they still there? Well, mostly, I think you and I would probably say, yeah, they are in some ways, but it's still,
not really.
You have to get philosophical when you talk about things like that.
Right. It can get pretty lonely. It gets pretty lonely, right? I mean, it's because subjectivities actually are the issue. It's not the bodies. The bodies, but the subjectivities are the issues when you are actually coming together in contact. So no, you're right about all of this. And so
the point I was going to mention before I got sidetracked on that point, I told you I'd come back and say what it was, but developmentalists, almost all of them have, once they've come up with the stages that they think are relatively real, and again, it's usually 6 to 8 of them or 9, right around there. They'll almost always, or have been doing all along, actually taking real populations and giving them whatever metric, whatever test they've come up with to help determine what stage they're at. And so you can usually find in most developmentalists some list of how many people are at each stage.
Right.
And of course, in terms of overall number of stages, it's like an inverted pyramid.
Right.
Because everybody goes through the first stage, but some people will drop out by the second stage. Even if you just look at the stages that are postulated to exist theoretically, not even at stages that people are really at. If you start to look at that, what you'll tend to see is that there's a slow rise over time with the stage that is the largest number of people.
Right.
So it ends up looking not like an inverted pyramid, but more like an hourglass. So the number of people that are actually at sensory motor, for example, is relatively smaller than the number of people that are actually go through the pre-egoic stages. And then those are actually less than the people at the ethnocentric stages. And then it can start to drop off at world-centric and pluralistic and integral. And the point is that the people at the highest stage, there really are very, very few people that make it to most of any of the model's higher stages. So in spiral dynamics, for example, the number of people at their integral, they call it turquoise or integrated stage, is 0.5% of the population.
Wow.
So when you're scoring at that level,
right,
and somebody who is really interested in this kind of stuff wanted to work with somebody,
That's
you
right.
would be top of that list. I can
Yes,
see
yes.
why Jane Lovinger would go, whoa, I found
Right.
one of the 0.5%.
Right.
That's what I
Yeah.
want to work with.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think she probably picked out most of her team that way. I came to see it as I looked back
Yeah,
over the group that I was in and saw their dissertations and everything. She was looking for those people because she had a metric. She had a book, a score book that it would be like a computer algorithm now that dealt with most of those earlier stages. But when it came to the later ones, she had to have individuals who talked to each other to
right,
score those protocols.
right,
So she had to have people that could talk about those protocols.
right,
So she was picking out people. She was giving these tests in her seminars,
right,
just as an experiment to show us what the test was like. We took the sentence completion test for ego development.
right.
And, when I took it innocently. I didn't know. I mean, she collected. I didn't even know how to score it or anything.
Yeah,
And then she called me after that, and said, well, who are you and what are you doing? And that was the beginning of my many years of being with her. She and I corresponded through her whole life. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting problem. I hadn't even thought through it exactly as you're saying it, but that's what she was looking for, is her research team. So yeah.
right. Well, I think if you and I were left our own devices, we'd keep talking about the
That's right.
importance of growing up and how irritating it is that it isn't better known.
Yes.
That's really my number one complaint about this. Isn't that we need more research, or that some of it has to be done better. I mean, all of that is certainly true in a certain sense. My biggest complaint is that it's so rarely understood or included or talked about. It's just, I mean, I've sort of gotten a bit of hit on that because my system does include a very strong component of growing up. And so when I get feedback from professors, even, and from really great universities, one of the most common things I hear about is, I'm so glad I found out about growing up. And I go, really? I had to tell you about that?
Yes.
Ah.
I know.
And you're teaching at Yale? You're teaching at Harvard? How did you get in there? Anyway, it really drives me crazy. But I suppose we'll move on to cleaning up.
Let's do cleaning up, showing up, and opening up, and then let's go to the contemporary situation we're in now. Yeah.
Sure. The thing about cleaning up is it's at least been heard of by a fair number of people, particularly because what it refers to is any system that a person could undertake which will help them deal with their shadow or their unconscious, or if they have neurotic problems or even psychotic problems. It's what we refer to as psychological issues, basically. And I included it because, well, what I'm trying to include when I include waking up and growing up and cleaning up and opening up and showing up are aspects of human development, or just human potentials in general, that are very poorly understood, or at least fairly rarely discussed when you're bringing up problems. And they're all areas that, as we can see, as we're continuing to talk about it, are extremely important for virtually anything that exists, or certainly anything that a human being might do. And so when we talk about international relations or politics or business, upper management, all of these are areas that a fully functioning person will be aware of and will generally be engaged in one way or another. And I included cleaning up here because even though a lot of people go to therapy or have a therapist, the process itself is not well understood by the general public. And so what I wanted to do, and the reason I keep including it, is I'm including, first of all, just the basic area that we would call psychotherapy. are, and the reason people have heard about it is most people have heard about psychoanalysis, or they at least know the name Freud, if they don't know exactly what he said, or something like that. But it truly is important. And what I'm including, when I include cleaning up, I make it clear that you can take any approach that works for you when you engage in the process of cleaning up. But I have a particular explanation for how and why it works. And the therapeutic process that I generally recommend is one that I stumbled on. It was one of the earliest sort of quote discoveries that I had come up with. And it came because I got involved in Gestalt therapy right along when I was doing Zen. Simply because at the time it was fairly common to do Zen and you do Gestalt and stuff like that.
Well, Fritz Perls was also practice
Right,
of Zen.
right. And I, of course, was aware of him because I was following all the human potential growth movements. And he was a big name at Esalen Institute, which was the premier growth center that was founded by my good friend, Mike Murphy. And Fritz Perls famously said, I can cure any neurosis in 15 minutes. And the joke is he sort of could. I mean, and that's why he had this enormous reputation of being this utterly amazing therapist. And I went through, when I came up with this therapeutic process that I'm about to give a brief explanation of, I went through and took all of the published manuscripts of all of his dialogues with all of the people that we would call his patients. They were just people that he would interact with in growth seminars that were occurring. And he had an empty chair, and he would always sit them in the empty chair, and he would have them talk with whatever their problem was. And then after they identified the problem, he'd have them talk back and forth between the problems. So if the problem was you're having a continuing nightmare where there's a big monster and it's trying to eat you alive, that kind of thing, he'd have you put the monster in the chair and talk to the monster and then answer as the monster and have them talk back and forth. And this big monster, this nightmare that they're having, is causing them an enormous amount of anxiety, let's say. And so after having them talk back and forth with their symptom, usually fairly quickly, usually within 15 or 20 minutes, they would click and they would actually end up identifying with, in this case, it would be the monster. And what they would find is that the monster has this enormous amount of anger or aggression towards it. And the person had sort of stopped getting angry or stopped having any aggression. They were clearly, quote, repressing their anger. And that's what was causing the anxiety they were feeling. And so once they re-identified with that anger, then their anxiety would tend to vanish. Now, this stuff, similar kinds of things would happen often enough that Perls would say, I can cure any neurosis in 15 minutes.
I see.
And it was only later that I realized what he was actually doing. And this is as I began discussing what we'll talk about in a minute, which I call the quadrants. And when you include all quadrants, then you have what I call showing up. There's for the major dimensions of human existence. And these dimensions show up in all sorts of ways in human life, including the three perspectives on the three universal pronoun systems that we have. We have first person, second person, and third person. And first person is defined as the person who is speaking. So that's I, me, mine. Second person is the person being spoken to. That's you or thou. And third person is the person or thing being spoken about. So that's a him, her, they, them, or just an it or plural its. And so what Perls was doing was Well, I'll describe what Pearls is doing after I give a brief explanation of my general theory of what causes neurosis or what causes psychological problems. And that is, if you look at all of the research that's written up on various studies and the various theories, what you'll generally find for somebody who's actually repressing something out of their conscious mind into something that we call their unconscious, is that whatever they're getting rid of starts out as a first person. In other words, they're aware of it. And they'll say, I'm so damn angry now, or I'm so hungry now, or I'm so horny now, or whatever it is. And then for various reasons, it varies from person to person. If they're going to repress that, if they're going to get rid of it, they start to shove it out of their consciousness. And the first place you'll shove that to is the second person.
Yeah.
And they're sometimes called a subpersonality in the therapeutic sense. And so you've already pushed it out of directly identifying with it.
Or projection.
Well, that's, yes, and that can especially happen when they go further. And if repressing it to just second person isn't enough, it's still too close and they can still hear it, they'll shove it all the way to third person.
Third person.
And that's when they make it, it doesn't, I'm not angry, but they are.
Yeah.
Or I'm not angry, but she is.
Right.
And then that's when it converts into an it, or third person. So you have first person to second person to third person is the general path of dissociation or repression.
Yeah.
And what Pearls was doing was exactly reversing that path.
Yeah.
He would start and he'd have them identified as a third person. And they'd often talk about it as in an it language. Oh, the anxiety, it's driving me crazy. Oh, the depression, I can't control it. Oh, the desire to eat, I don't have any say over it, and so on. Right. And he'll have them convert it from that third person it to a second person you. He'll have them talk to it directly by putting them in the empty chair. So whatever it is that you're pushing out, if it's sex, then you talk to your sex drive. If it's anger, you talk to your anger. Often the result of repressing it to third person will be the creation of a certain type of symptom, a neurotic symptom or even psychotic symptom. And so if that's the form that their second person's in, he'll have them, like I said with the example of the monster causing anxiety, he'll have them talk directly to the symptom. In this case, it would be the monster, which is the symptom of your repressing your anger, and it's showing up in a monster form in your dreams. So he would have you just go back and forth talking to it in second person. Then you'd actually talk directly to it as if it's, okay, why are you doing this to me? What do you mean? What's going on? That kind of thing. And then he'd have them respond by taking that role. And as they continue to do that, what you see happening is they're becoming more comfortable even when they play the role of like the monster. So even when they're identifying temporarily as the monster in order to answer themselves back, since a second person discussion means the first and the second person are talking. So the person that has a symptom is assuming the first person and the second person. So what they're doing is they're getting closer and closer to the second person reality as they're identifying with it to respond to themselves in the discussion. And that technically was the third step, when they would actually end up identifying with what that second person was, then they've taken back that projection. So
yes, I mean, in a certain sense, I mean, what you're describing also is that shift from objectifying to subjectivity. I mean, that goes on also, you know, between people. I do a lot of couples therapy, and what I see inevitably is that the one partner fashions the other partner as a certain kind of enemy and they can't then experience the
Right.
other person any other way, which
Right.
evokes in the other person,
Right.
that same experience. And so at the point that the original person experiences the other person as a subject, a lot of the issues just
Right.
fall away. But
Right.
if they simply see them as the it, or the
Right.
object, then it's not possible.
Right.
Yeah. So you then fashioned a therapy based on this
Yeah,
post.
and as I said, when what I realized after I had sort of created this and labeled it the 3-2-1 process, because you're taking a third person, converting it to second, converting it back to first. And I think actually it was the first thing of mine I ever wrote that was actually published. And I was like 19 years old or something. It was published in a fairly widespread journal, technical journal at the time. I think it was called Psychotherapy Theory Practice.
The research, yeah.
Yeah.
Psychotherapy journal, yeah.
Right.
Right.
And it really came home to me how it didn't cover everything, of course, but how essentially correct it was for what it was doing. When I read and realized that Freud, in his writings, never once used the word ego or id.
Right.
His translator, James Strachey, added those words, which are Latin, because he thought it made Freud sound more scientific. And so famously, when Freud was asked what psychoanalysis does, he responded the way it's translated, where it was, their ego shall be.
Right.
And the way Freud actually wrote was he used the real pronouns, the German pronouns for those words. So instead of ego, he would refer to the I.
Right.
Instead of id, he referred to the it.
Right.
So he wouldn't say things like the id can disturb the ego. He would say that the it can disturb the I.
Exactly.
And that's exactly what you're doing. So when he said where id was, their ego shall be, what he really said was where it was, their I shall become.
Right, exactly.
And that was a brilliant summary of what psychotherapy did.
Right. I agree. And that translation, was a real problem, but I think it was like along the lines of so many of these issues for humans.
Right.
The intention really was to make it more theoretical so it could be debated, but because there really wasn't an understanding of phenomenology at that moment, it could have been kept more phenomenological, and then it might have been practiced more more completely. But by doing this, making this other move, it went the other way. So your cleaning up then is really a therapeutic cleaning up.
Yes, basically that's what it does. And in the general, under the general topic, of course, I'll discuss the psychotherapy in general and various theories of psychotherapy. And one of the other areas that I do agree with is that if you look at developmental levels, and I'll just keep using Gebser's terms that gets started, but archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, and integral.
Right.
For each one of those stages in terms of projection, now I know for psychoanalysis, projection is always in the hierarchy of defense mechanisms. It's always the first and essentially the lowest. And the reason is psychoanalytic theory interprets them in a very concrete fashion. And the reason projection and introjection are mentioned as the first earliest defense mechanisms that we have is they only count as real projection and real introjection, the cross-boundary stuff that forms when the boundary itself is very tenuous and is first forming. And so, of course, that's the first stage of psychological development, is developing a self-boundary.
Yes.
And so that's the only place that they recognize interjection and projection occurring. But what Fitzgerald did and theoretically did, and which I agreed with, is that projection is a type of multi-level phenomena. You can project anything that you become unaware of at virtually any stage of development.
Right.
So you can, and then you can also, there would be magic shadow elements that could be projected, mythic shadow elements that could be projected, rational elements, and so on.
Right.
And so because of that, and because that kind of projection is so widespread, then I generally, I've included cleaning up as really important, one of these frameworks that all human beings should know about. And it's a really interesting process, because what it means is not just if you have some unconscious, like, let's say, mythic element, and you project that onto the external world, and you project it because you really hate that element. And so it's true that you'll then, the person or things that you project that mythic element onto will be things that you will really dislike. And that's true, but that's not the only meaning of that. What it really means, if you look at the actual mechanism of what projection does and how we react to it, it means that virtually anything in the environment, if it simply informs you, there's very likely very little projection going on. But if those things, and this theory would add virtually anything that you loathe or hate or find disgusting, is something that you projected. Because the reason you hate it is that you hated it in yourself first. And that's why you got rid of it. That's why you threw it overboard. That's why you projected it. And so it's simply one of the ways that psychotherapy would join in, for example, any of the great waking up systems. Zen Buddhism maintains that you're one with everything, and so you hate nothing. And so Buddhism actually stresses compassion for all people. And so this is just agreeing with that, and then giving a little mechanism that often accounts for that. There's, generally speaking, the great waking up traditions like Zen or Vedanta or Christian mysticism, the cloud of unknowing, and so on. What they're generally taken to be doing is expressing a reality of what the world really looks like. It's often called an ultimate reality. But it's a reality. So in reality, we're not going to hate this person or that quality or that. And so in our relative selves, we do. Why is it just there? Well, because in the relative self, where we have a capacity of defense mechanisms, and interjection and projection are very crucial aspects. So we want to clean that up.
Yeah, I see how that does fit with, in the Dhammapada, where the Buddha teaches that you can never cure hatred through hatred, only through non-hatred. And I like to teach that rather than love, just to teach the non-hatred statement. Because if we could get to non-hatred, which is equanimity really is, that's good enough. And what you're saying does remind me of the issues that surround disgust and moral superiority, which is pretty much the mover for a lot of cancel culture and a lot of the calling out kind of thing. And what you're saying is that in cleaning that up, what you're doing is that you're taking away the experience of disgust per se. You're recognizing that is self. And so that if you have this sense of hating it, then it's an indicator that you haven't cleaned it up. That you haven't cleaned it up.
As in virtually every one of the frames that I've included in the integral approach, the net result of them is an increase or an expansion of consciousness. And whether it's waking up, that's obviously I'm one with everything. Growing up, it includes, each level of growing up transcends and includes the previous stage. So they just get more and more inclusive and systemic and integrated. And cleaning up it really is the opposite tendency of our sort of our native defense mechanism of projection,
Right.
which takes something out of the whole self and puts it in the environment. So the net results make the self smaller and smaller, the environment bigger and bigger, just the opposite direction that evolution is moving.
Right.
And so to clean up is to bring that back in and
Right.
experience a whole and healthy psyche.
Yes, yes. Where
and
where there's nothing that's excluded, and and yet when you're working in therapy with people, one of the most difficult things that I still do a lot of psychotherapy actually, is people come to therapy, they want to change or improve or grow or whatever. They have to first get to know themselves. It's like a befriending process. You have to get to know what you do.
right,
Once you get to know what you actually do, how you are, what you're thinking, and so on, which you may get to know through a relationship with me, but through
right,
your dreams, through your other relationships,
right,
then you have to accept that.
right,
You cannot say, hey, I'd like to send that part back.
yeah,
That's not really the way I wanted to be.
right,
No, you have to accept it.
right,
In accepting it, you become compassionate towards
right,
it. You don't lay the compassion on it. You
yeah,
have to actually know it and accept it.
yeah,
And
and
that's the hard part.
that doesn't seem to be, how do I want to say this? It's people aren't grown with an understanding of that approach. Yeah, I
Right.
mean, every defense mechanism they have sort of works against that. And,
Exactly.
and so
Exactly.
they have to learn. It makes sense to those of
Yeah.
us who have some understanding of it, that would be a central, important aspect of doing with psychotherapy. And you need to add in almost anybody who comes to me at the beginning that doesn't understand
Yeah.
that, or they're
Yeah.
not fully
Yeah.
doing that.
Right.
And
Right.
it has to be taught in a
Yes.
certain sense.
Yeah. It's like you have to experience yourself actually as a subject.
Right.
And most of us do in our minds experience a narration about
Right.
ourselves as objects.
Right.
So, it's, but the really difficult thing for me at this point in my life is the kind of maybe we can shift gears here. I want to do showing up, but I don't want to miss examining our current
Sure.
culture. I mean, one of the difficult things right now is this sense. The terms I would put it in are very similar to what you've said about cleaning up, but it's the sense of idealization and splitting, where
Right.
people are just actually changing everybody into an enemy.
Right.
And it's a this enemy and a that enemy, and a virus enemy and a disease enemy and a nation enemy, and many of these let's say I don't know, movements, points of view, and so on, are related to progressive politics, which is where I have been through my entire life,
Right.
and just not being able to recognize what happened to the left, what happened to the anti-war movement, what
Right.
happened to freedom of speech, what happened to the sort of tolerance for different points of view. It's a great grief for me. It's
Right.
not like a sort of a simple thing, because I live in a progressive state, in the state of Vermont. I love where I live. It's very hard to talk to people anymore about the things that I thought were fundamentally the case in progressive politics. So I want to make our move from talking about all these frames of reference to analyzing what has happened to the sort of political left, you could call it, or you could call it liberalism, or
Sure.
you could call it liberal education. I mean, all
Sure.
of these things, they're the same, in the same paradigm. So
Right.
can we make that shift over to talking about that?
Sure. One of the reasons that an integral framework, that the people that are finding it useful are people that don't know about most of these frames. And they learn about them, like the professor that writes me and says, thanks for teaching me about growing up. I didn't know the other stages where, if you look at most of the stages of development that many of the well-known developmental models use, they are essentially, because all of them seem to cover essentially broadly similar stages of development.
Right.
And that's what the integral psychology book was all about, was by including 100 charts. And I just put all the charts in the book so people could see 100 different developmental models from all over the world. And the thing that you can't miss when you do that is that their specific stages are named differently, but you can see them going through quite similar-ish general stages.
It's reality. In other words, it's reality.
Right, exactly. And particularly important is when we get from archaic to magic to mythic, and those also have, magic tends to have a pre-ego-centric, also known as narcissistic sense of development. And so in magic, and also the mind is just learning to differentiate itself from the environment, and it doesn't always distinguish subject and object very clearly. So it will imagine that if I want to change that thing, I can just say a magic spell over it and that will change that thing. So to change the image of the thing is the same as to change the thing. And that's the definition of magic. And then mythic tends to move more into the concrete operational stages. It's still, because it's named mythic, because even though it's often referring to something real, that isn't itself a real reality. So myths are Zeus, Apollo, Jehovah, Allah, any of those types of mythic figures. And what happens there is that they retain the magic that humans used to maintain. And so what humans then attempt to do is approach that mythic deity correctly. It will perform magic on your behalf. And so that tends to become what a lot of the religions are involved with. Not all of them. Some of them get into waking up quite clearly, like Vedanta.
But there is that aspect to all the religions, and of course, you can recognize it a bit in child development too, where you have that sort of magical realism of childhood. And then what Loevinger called the opportunistic stage was about 4 years old, where you begin to manipulate this, and you're moving towards a social group and conformity and so on, but you're still trying to manipulate the powers so you can get them to do what you want to do. And when that occurs in adult life, it looks like what you were talking about, that there are gods, and you're trying to get the favor to take this magic in the direction you want it. So,
and many of the models will subdivide some of these brief stages that I'm going to mention, as you know. And so I'm just giving certain basic outlines. But beyond mythic is the emergence, which is indeed ethnocentric. It means whatever my idea of truth is, there's one group of people that has it, and everybody else is other. So it's a heavy self versus other distinction and so on. And then when it moves up to rational, it generally demonstrates a capacity to move from ethnocentric to world-centric stages. And that means there's a general attempt at most of what's generally referred to as rational stage, concrete operational.
Yes, Loevinger calls that conscientious. I mean, so she goes from the conformity to self-aware to conscientious, and she had to split that conformity stage by her data. So she split it to conformity and self-aware. And then the next one was what she called conscientious. But again, it's getting a sense of self within a group, and recognizing that if you identify with your group, then you've got more security and more power and so on.
And as an actual stage of development, historically, if we look at that, the emergence of that rational stage of development generally occurred with what we call the Western Enlightenment.
Right, right.
And that's why starting in around 1600, you see the emergence of virtually all of the modern sciences, modern astronomy, modern chemistry, modern physics, and so on, because we were actually getting rational about it. Also, during that period, for really the first time in history, humanity got rid of slavery.
Right.
I mean, it took that long. In America, of course, we fought an extraordinary war in 1860 to get rid of slavery.
Right.
And basically during about a 100-year period from around 1760 to 1860, every rational industrial country on the face of the planet got rid of slavery. But it wasn't until then, that's just about 200 years ago.
Right.
All previous stages were at pre-rational stages of cultural development, and therefore we had slavery. And even people like Aristotle, they were fine.
Of course, because there was a completely different window. There was a different worldview.
That's right.
And actually, I think the again, going back to Lovinger's language, but becoming self-aware, it's awareness of one's subjectivity, and it gives awareness then eventually that there are other subjects. I mean that it's not that we're somehow objects that are to be used as a resource in the way that previously there would have been the idea of the god or the king or whatever and the service to that, and then that subjectivity. I mean the Western Enlightenment about the pursuit of individual freedom was extraordinary. Actually it was extraordinary. It's as big as any Chinese and Indian Enlightenment. I'm agreeing totally. Gotcha.
And what we're tracking here, of course, is stages of growing up.
Right.
And so it's going from rational, from mythic to rational, and then as it continues to move it towards more pluralistic stages, that tends to be what we nowadays call postmodern. Postmodernism. And in 1959 in America, the percent of the population that was at the green, and green is what I call the stage, it comes after rational stage itself. So that's like conscientious.
In Lovinger's, I think it would be conscientious. And I was just thinking in Bill Perry's model, also some of the words from the ethical development in the college years. You're using some of, like, pluralism is also the word he uses there. And she uses conscientious. And yes, go ahead. It's the recognition of these.
Well, according to at least one model, in the percent of the population at the green postmodern stage in 1959 was about 3%. At 1972, Jacques Derrida was the most frequently quoted academic writer in America. And we were moving towards what spiral dynamics would say is about 20% of the population at green. So a whole lot of what we get with the boomers is a generational shift from the center of gravity, which was rational, to a center of gravity that was postmodern. And the rational stage was generally referred to as modernity. And that generally first emerged with the Western Enlightenment. And then postmodernity, and which I'm pointing out, is essentially emerged with the generation, the boomer generation. It quickly went from 3% to 20-ish percent, or a considerable amount. And that is a large part of what changed the nature of boomers, because the main difference between rational and pluralistic postmodern stages of development is that the rational is the first that gloms onto universal
Mhm.
understandings. And
Right.
that's why it's called world-centric, because the whole aim of that stage is to treat all people fairly, regardless of
That's right.
race, color, sex, or creed. And that was fairly rare development. Again, it's
Right.
just
Right.
a couple hundred years
It's
ago.
right.
And then, but what happens when you move to the pluralistic postmodern stage is because it can reflect on the rational universal stage, it can also differentiate that into, well, what's often called a multicultural view.
Right.
And that's simply saying, oh yeah, okay, we don't have Protestant chemistry versus Hindu chemistry. We just have chemistry. That's
Mhm.
what's discovered by the rational level. But then the
Mhm.
postmodern stage would look at that and go, wait a minute, those are different cultures. They've got
Right.
different truths
Right.
going on. We
Right.
should pay
Right.
attention to those.
Right.
And so that multicultural diversity value started to become predominant.
Right.
And unfortunately, that all stages have pluses and minuses, ways that they can be healthy, ways they can be unhealthy. And it's fairly easy with the multi-variant, multicultural structure to take it to extremes, particularly because you realize there's a moral dimension involved and you're trying to morally include all people, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed.
Right.
So you can get very, very absolutistic about that. And when you do that, when you get absolutistic about any belief you have, remember Maslow called the ethnocentric stage the absolutistic stage.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
rational stage you call the multiplistic.
Right.
The green stage you call the relativistic.
Right.
And that's essentially what the direction that a lot of our values went. And when you're at the relativistic stage, but you attack it with an absolutistic approach, then according to Maslow, you end up at the absolutistic stage.
Right.
You'll end
You
up
kind of
with ethnocentric beliefs.
you're kind of reverting to, well, let me just say that using the language of Bill Perry's,
Right,
when you get into these, when you get into the pluralism and the
right,
postmodernism and relativism,
right,
what has to happen for you to develop from there is to realize that you have to commit yourself to an ethic. The ethic is not coming from the outside of you,
right,
but you can't do without a moral ethical stance
right,
yourself, or you'll just be swallowed up
right,
by this constant, what I would call projection and projective
right,
identification. It's like you get into a food fight that is going on all the time unless you take a position. But the position you take, and this again, where the Harvard students were moving through this intellectual and ethical development in their college years, it was really only the minority of them that
right,
could recognize that the truth is not out there. You
right,
have to actually take a position
right,
that you think is true and operate from a moral perspective on that position. And that will take you to the next level, which is this kind of committed to kind of level that
right,
you commit yourself to whatever it is,
right,
no. So I think when I was younger, I think that I assumed that people were making the step
right,
from looking at war to committing themselves to no war,
right,
instead of the step of where I can look back at the peace movement and say that it was more or less the attempt to impose harmony,
right,
which really won't work.
right,
But it's there's a way that the breakdown of relativism and postmodernity and so on, it could break down
right,
to the opportunistic stage, or the
right.
stage that you call, I guess that's the
Absolutistic. Yeah.
absolutistic, or
Ethnocentric. Yeah.
ethnocentric. I'm not sure if that's the magic or the mythic, but in
It's
any
a
case,
mythic.
That's the mythic. And so
Right.
it's like everybody is in a small bubble that's all they know about is
Right.
to protect that bubble.
Right.
Yeah.
And that can really be a problem because, again, it's involving what is technically a higher stage of
Yeah.
development, and it moves beyond the individualistic, it moves beyond the conformist,
Right.
and it moves beyond rational. And sometimes being aware of that can even make the problem worse.
Yeah.
But they can get, quote, full of themselves in favor of something like harmony.
Yeah.
So it sounds like this is really a good deal. And it sounds so good that many of them, of course, on college campuses today, won't even talk to people that disagree with them.
Right. Right.
So, and it's also, I think, one of the problems that we see present in the political situation at large, because for several hundred years, ever since the orange, rational, modern stage emerged, and because they were so different from the traditional ethnocentric
Right.
mythic stage,
Right.
they, of course, had a different political orientation. And where slavery, for example, was fine with the mythic
Right.
absolutistic stage, it wasn't fine with the world-centric rational stage. And that's why that's not until that stage emerged that we actually got rid of slavery.
Right.
But it also, that meant that they had to have a different political orientation. And the name they gave their orientation was liberal, from the French liberté.
Right.
Which is, and that's why it was a liberté, freedom, that stage valued enormously. And that's why slaves were set free by that value structure. And it just so happened that in the French Parliament, these new liberal wise guys sat on the left of the king, and the old traditional sat on the right.
On the right. Right.
And they were actually called that, the left and the right, and those names just stuck. And so that's what we still have today, is the left or the right. Now the problem is, when it was just the right ethnocentric absolutistic stage and the left orange world-centric rational stage, they stayed pretty much in their own corner. I mean, they sort of pretty much knew what the other one felt or believed, and you were generally fairly strongly right or fairly strongly left. You pick one, and it was stable, so you always knew what it meant. And the problem is, as green, multicultural started to emerge, postmodernism started to emerge, because the liberals, called it also a frequently name they used themselves, was progressives.
Right.
They were, many of them did tend to be at the leading edge of development. And so many of the people on the left, and particularly the Democrats, ended up shifting upwards. I don't know what percentage it was, let's say 50% for the moment. So 50% of them stayed at old-fashioned leftist rational values, and 50% of them went to
the postmodern.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right.
And those were both still tended to be left political orientations. Only this far left, so to speak, the multicultural far left, they of course really didn't like the old left that much. And neither of the left got along with the original right.
Right.
But since this shift upwards represented a general cultural evolutionary move, the old right also, part of them stepped in, about half, we'll say, stepped into their next level, which was orange rational.
Right.
And these became the so-called Wall Street Republicans, or today in the culture wars, they're the people that actually speak out vocally for things like the First Amendment, free
Right,
speech,
right,
because
right,
that's the level they're directly coming from.
right.
Whereas the left doesn't really like that anymore. They'll interrupt free speech. Well, hate speech is not allowed,
Mhm.
even though the Supreme Court says it is allowed under the First Amendment, not for the far left, not for the multiculturalists, it isn't. So,
Except I mean, what comes in here, and I want to kind of introduce this, is the issue around whose hate speech,
right,
you know, and this is again the issue of imposing harmony or imposing your values of hate speech.
right,
What seems not to be worked through, and I'm not sure how to understand this, but there is some sort of disavowal of a certain kind of morality, so that lying is suddenly okay,
right,
you know, and cheating is okay, and also deciding whose hate speech counts for which skin color is
right,
okay. It's as though that I sometimes think about Lovinger's stages, because they come back to me
right,
where you move from the opportunistic to conformity to self-aware.
right,
At the self-aware stage, you can slip back to opportunistic easily. And she was often trying to show various political figures. And she would often use Richard Nixon as an
right,
example, whose work actually fitted with the opportunistic level of development, even
right,
though he was trying to be self-aware.
right,
So there was like a slippery slope
right,
that's also a little bit like, Piaget has the same idea in what he calls décollage,
right,
that when you're trying to make a new step, you slip back.
right,
And then you have to reorganize there and do the whole thing again. And, sometimes I feel like we're in this kind of décollage
right,
where there's this slipping back, and it's very much like this opportunistic
right,
flavor to it.
right.
Uh,
And the only
it,
thing, well,
yeah, go ahead. No, it's just that I tend to then want to return to. I often get into this idea that the baby boomers left their religions too quickly. Not that I'm unhappy with the religion I took on, but I actually practice it as a religion,
right,
not a spirituality.
right,
But I think we walked away from the churches, the synagogues, our various groups that could help us actually contain something
right,
while we were making the developments,
right,
instead of trying everything as an individual.
right,
I mean, the individual's pretty weak. You can't actually, until you've woken up quite a
right,
bit, I mean, a true waking up,
right,
it's very hard to be able to restrain
right.
as an individual. Yeah.
Yeah, and
So,
I mean, that's essentially, certainly in the ballpark that I was talking about of the regression
yeah.
downward. And yeah, I find it very interesting that when you listen to the social commentators on TV and they're in their culture war, some of the interesting names that are applied to these people that are sliding back down. A lot of bright people on the right actually refer to them as the regressive left,
Oh,
because that's what they're doing.
yeah.
They
Yeah.
have this
Yeah.
relativistic mouthpiece, which
Right.
wants to include everything,
Right.
but being relativistic, it actually makes all these choices that you're talking about, which is what's kind of hate speech we have to get rid of, what's kind of
Right.
okay. When I say I
Right.
agree with everything, I disagree with everything except what white males want,
Right.
they
Right.
have to be
Right.
excluded.
Right.
And it's very easy. And I think the reason Maslow raised the point is it's very easy to go from relativistic back to absolutistic.
Yeah.
And then when you do that, you are going to adopt your views with the same attitude that somebody at a fundamentalistic religious
Right.
point would make. And that's the other thing that I hear the left accused of a lot is, well, it's a fundamentalism religion.
Right,
And
right,
in a sense, to
right,
the extent that it's coming from that ethnocentric mythic stage,
right,
it is. It's
right.
exactly. Um, so it has its own forms of heresy and its own forms of
Oh,
blasphemy
yes,
and its
yes,
own dogma and what you're allowed to say. And everybody speaks exactly the same language and has
right,
the same agreement. And it's so absolutistically boring.
right,
It's
right.
just alarming.
What's extremely conforming. But the other thing is that, I mean, back when I was working with Jane, she would also talk about the conformity of hippies. Like she
Yeah,
really didn't love the fact that they all looked alike.
right,
But the issue that concerns me so much about anti-racism
right,
is that skin color has once again become the determinant of how we try to understand a person.
right,
And so if it is actually, if we're driven by talking about people's appearances, then we're driven back into the very thing that people were trying to escape from
right,
in actually working against racism. And it becomes so circular that it truly is chaotic. It's not understandable. It's not rational. Then
right,
you're slipping back to the pre-rational again.
right,
And without any kind of knowledge that this is happening, there may be people that are really very how to like well-intentioned,
right,
wanting to bring about something that's good, but using the methods that will absolutely lead to opportunism, to
right,
lying, to cheating, to
right,
stealing, and then again to some kind of racism.
right.
It's inevitable because it's all built in. And
Yeah,
I don't, and in a certain sense, I don't know what to do about it. I find some people on the left, people like Naomi Wolf or Glenn Greenwald or Matt Taibbi or Charles Eisenstein, some of the people that I've had a chance to kind of speak to or get closer to in this period of time.
right,
Robert Kennedy, there are some others, that they're able to speak about these problems, but they don't have the developmental view.
right,
They don't see the actual, they don't see the problem as a paradigm.
right,
It's not just a moment in time. you know
right.
yeah,
People, although nobody is born understanding the exact stages of development, humans do seem to have this generalized sense of what's a developmental move and what's a regressive move.
yes, you're right
And,
about that, I think.
right. And even if you look at green postmodernism political theory, one of the things that it puts front and center is identity politics.
Yeah,
And identity politics is its exact structure comes from the ethnocentric absolutistic stage,
yes,
because every ethnic group has its own identity
identity, right,
and you have to latch
yes,
on to that. And so one of the reasons that a lot of bright people on the right will refer to the regressive left is they don't know anything about developmental psychology, but they can feel this
yeah,
sort of something has gone wrong here.
right,
It's going backwards somehow.
right,
And a
right,
lot of the Democrats, the old time, original,
right,
rational, world-centric, orange
right.
Democrat, their most common thing you hear from them is, I didn't leave my party left me.
Yes, exactly.
Their
Yes,
party bounced up
yes,
that stage and then
yeah,
in an absolutistic or regressive fashion.
yes,
And
exactly.
that's really drives the old original left nuts.
Oh, I know. I know. I interviewed Diana Johnstone and had a wonderful conversation with her. She's an American journalist who's about 85. She lives in
Right,
Paris. And she, has spent her life in progressive politics, and she's driven nuts by the whole thing. She just feels like the only hope she has is that
yeah,
she says, life is interesting and something new is likely to happen.
yeah,
But other than that, she doesn't feel
right,
hopeful.
right. Well, I really do think a lot of the problems that we're seeing with the culture wars right now is the fact that there are these three major levels of development. And by the way, in my own relatively summary model, the stage beyond the postmodern is the beginning of an integral stages.
Mm-hmm.
So whether they're Perry's commitment or Lovinger's
She had the, I think hers,
autonomous.
yes, autonomous. Autonomous was not a great word there, but that's the
Right.
word she used.
Yeah.
Autonomous and then to integrated. Yes,
Right.
yes,
Um,
yes.
So, but because we do have these three stages leading up to those two stages, a culture always is divided among many, many ways. You can divide cultures and through many different lenses, but they often have large pockets of their cultures that come from one of the major stages of development. They certainly have an option, a philosophical system or a political system or religious system that will often stem from one of these. And since the majority of the population is at those three pre-integral stages, as we said, well, spiral dynamics for the highest integral stages gives 0.5% of the population, as we were pointing out. And then depending on which model you use, I don't remember what Lovinger's autonomous stage was, but it was 10% or less, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And it was more or less the committed idea that Perry has, that you
Right.
become autonomous by recognizing that you commit yourself to a
Right.
particular moral structure, and that your responsibility comes from your own individuality. It's not coming from
Right.
the outside, but yet you must take it. It's like Leonard Cohen says, though your promise counts for nothing, you must make it anyway.
Right.
You know, you recognize that your promise may count for nothing, but you're making it, and
Right.
that's the autonomous
Right.
perspective. Yeah.
And then before that is green, orange, and
Yeah.
amber. And
Right.
those are exactly the three major value systems that are at war in the culture wars. So in the culture wars, there's clearly the original, rational, old-time left
Right.
Democrats.
Right.
And there's clearly the postmodern, multicultural, diversity, inclusivity group. But there's also, they don't usually get the attention, but there still are the religious fundamentalists do have a say.
Yeah.
And you'll hear them particularly in original Republican forms of what I call the old right, the original right, which came from those ethnocentric stages. And those were the stages that were present during the Enlightenment when the liberal orange rationalist stage first emerged. But those three don't like each other.
Right.
And one of the reasons that well, possibly one of the things that Lovinger was thinking about when she talked about the autonomous stage, the reason she called it autonomous, was not only that self-aware stance, but in the way you described it, not in the way that refers to the self-aware stage.
Right. Right. Right.
But in many of the models of development, in spiral dynamics, for example, we'll call the stages up to the integral stages are all first tier. And then the two integral stages are referred to as second tier. And the reason is that what Graves found for the particular type of research he was doing was that all of the first tier stages felt that their truth and values were the only real truth and values in the world. And everybody else was wrong or confused or childish or something. But then the move from that green pluralistic postmodern stage to the beginning of the integrated stages, he called it a monumental leap of meaning and cataclysmic, were the two phrases he used to talk about them. And what that means is, however you define first tier, if you look at the individual levels of descriptions of all of them, they are fairly self-believing.
Yeah.
And so we have these three stages that are going to be at each other's throat.
Yeah.
In general. And we're not going to get over that kind of infighting until a significant portion of the population, is at least 20%, I'd say, is moved into autonomous and integrated stages.
Yeah.
And as I track anyway, if you actually write down what the different combatants in the culture wars want, they come out as being quite closely related to the overall values of a particular stage. And as long as those are all first stages, by definitions, they're not going to get along.
Yeah.
And they're going to think that their truth and values is the only correct truth and values you can have.
Right.
And that's the definition of the culture wars.
Yeah.
Are people that are at it with this enormous amount of certainty. And we've already talked about how easy that is in the postmodern stage to latch on to your view with an absolutistic zealotry that can end up causing you to be part of a regressive left. And that's really problematic. But the same thing can happen if you're orange or amber, if you're multiplistic or ethnocentric. And so that is, this developmental sequence has been a very useful way for me to track a lot of what's going on in the culture wars. And I would recommend that you use your knowledge of the different stages to give it a whirl.
Well, everything you say from my point of view resonates completely. Yeah. I can't say that, I have not felt very hopeful about the changes that are happening in the outer world. I'm hopeful about other kinds of things that I think are going on in terms of consciousness and the understanding of the study of consciousness and physics and space-time and so on. But the outer world looks to me, still it looks very problematic for the very reasons you're talking about. And as you were speaking there, I was thinking a little bit about what Jack Block once said to me in some conversation, that we assimilate when we can and we accommodate when we must, that's the key to development, And so assimilate there is projection, really. It's like we project when we can and we stop doing that when we must. And, what I hope for over time is the possibility of people being able to have dialogue, to actually work with the polarizations from the point of view that we're human and we need the other side. Right now that seems to me very idealistic, although it's where I'm trying to work. But I worry that things are fragmenting, and it's like a 4-year-old food fight once again. And I thought we had come beyond that, but I apparently was wrong.
Yeah, it's the movement of cultural evolution. If you actually choose markers for that, it can be very, very discouraging.
Yeah.
One of the reasons that I fairly often will talk about stages of development when I'm in a quote argument with somebody over some culture war or another. But one of the reasons I don't take that up as a common used approach in that is I keep thinking about slavery.
Yeah.
And we think, treat all people fairly, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. That's become such a commonplace since the Western Enlightenment, since the rational stage actually reached 10 or 20% of the population. We got a cultural flip.
Right.
But that's still 200 years ago.
I know.
And
Yeah.
so we were on this planet since at least 200,000 years.
Yep.
And cultures had up to 90% slavery.
Yeah.
And even through ancient Greece,
Yes.
I mean, 1/3 of Athens' population were slaves.
Yes.
And we already said Aristotle didn't mind it. Plato
Right.
didn't mind. I mean,
Right.
it's alarming.
It's
And
alarming.
so, even though we have a history of the greats who apparently were really quite more evolved than their countrymen, we still don't get any anti-slavery rhetoric from coming from most of them.
I agree. I agree. I agree with everything you're saying. And let me say that on top of that, in a very practical way, when I'm working with couples in therapy, one person will often say, I want you to do this. And if I stop and say, if we're autonomous and we're equals here, you're not controlling the other person. And then often the question is, well, how do you get to somebody to do what you want them to do?
Right.
And I say, well, slavery. That's the way you do that.
Right.
That's taking away their autonomy.
Right.
But that's a shock to people.
Yeah.
Like the idea that you cannot get other people to do what you want them to do
Right.
is actually a shock.
Right.
So, I think you're right. We're not so far away from the slave ship. I was talking to Bayo Akamalafi several weeks ago, and he said, we're still on the slave ship.
Right.
We're still using this language, both sides, and it's like we have to pay attention to that. Really pay attention to that. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, so you're so right about so many things that I think I'm like a follower, and I hardly ever know you. But yes, it's really lovely to speak with you.
That's very nice. Well, we obviously think alike.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or we wouldn't have somebody like Jane Levenger in our prominent history.
I know. I do. And I saw that years ago in reading you, and I'm so happy you're in the world and that you're still in the world. And, and I'll come back, and I want to come back and talk to you again.
Sure.
I have to go right now, but it's really been wonderful, Ken. And I honestly, I can't thank you enough for your work. You've done it over a long period of time. It's noble. I really am very grateful.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you for the invitation.